device. Today we're catching up with our favorite Columbus historian and author of Ask Rufus in the Commercial Dispatch there in Columbus. Mr. Rufus Ward, you emailed me yesterday. You heard us talking about the Titanic?
I did, and you were referencing a person from the coast who may have been on it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an individual from Columbus who had involvement with it, and I thought you would find that interesting.
Absolutely, I would, Rufus. And, you know, when I was doing, and obviously my research was Google, Mississippi connection to Titanic. That's about the extent. And I did kind of go through and talk to our friend, Brother Rogers, over at Mississippi Department of Archives and Histories. He had never even heard of the Biloxi connection in an article that I had found. And I kind of went on a little bit of a scavenger hunt. And so I'm loving to hear that we may have more Mississippi connections to the Titanic. So what's this story, Rufus?
There was a doctor who had grown up in Columbus and went to New York to practice medicine and ended up being the physician for Isadora and Ida Strauss and the Rockefellers and the Colts and the Barrymores, number of prominent families. And he and the Strausses were good friends. He was their physician. When the Titanic sank and word came that the Carpathia was coming back into New York with survivors, he was asked to go and meet the Carpathia and make sure that the Strausses were all right, and if they were injured, see to them. Well, of course, they found out that they had gone down with the ship. That was the couple where he refused to get on a lifeboat before any other man, and she refused to leave her husband's side, and they both went down with the Titanic.
Aww.
So,
and that was portrayed in the movie too, right?
Yeah, that was it. That was in the movie. They had owned Macy's and were very prominent, and so Dr. Richards actually said he was the third person to board the Carpathia and discovered what had happened to them and started helping with other injured. There were about, I think, 106 people, survivors, injured, who were transported to St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan for treatment. And sometimes we don't hear the story of the injured and what happened to them afterwards.
Which I think we should, because I think those are like really interesting stories of folks, like what they do. Did they change their life, trajectory after surviving something like that? All those kinds of things. And I would think even for Dr. Richards, that had to be a real interesting turning point in his career to sort of be able to care for folks who had went through something so traumatic.
Yeah, and he had told me, he said two things made the biggest impression on him. He said, as the Carpathia was coming into New York Harbor, an electrical storm built up around it, and it was at night, and it got very dark, and the ship would be illuminated by flashes of lightning as it approached the docks. And see, he said it looked like something out of a science fiction movie, that it was just surrealistic. And I looked up newspaper accounts, and it's been a good bit in the newspaper talking about how strange the incident was, and it looked like it was a death ship coming into dock there. He also mentioned that the first thing anybody seemed to be doing was the White Star Line was putting workers on board to sand the name Titanic off the lifeboats and try and eliminate any reference to the name Titanic. And he found that really strange. It's like they wanted to try and wipe it out of history.
But then they go and name the sister ship after the Titanic, Britannic. I'm like, you could have stretched a little further than that if you wanted to, put some distance
the
between.
Britannic was already in the works.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that was already in the works at the time. It ended up being a hospital ship during World War I and was sunk by a German torpedo in the Mediterranean.
They just got bad juju, Rufus. That was just...
Yeah. I think it must have been. Apparently there was about thousands of people turned out on the docks to to see the Carpathia come in, and there were so many prominent people who were lost. One of the interesting things about St. Vincent's Hospital, it was a Catholic hospital, and they said that the first-class passengers could all afford to have their private physicians show up at the dock, which is how Dr. Richards got there for the Strausses. And they said they were sending a fleet of ambulances, but they would only transport the lower class, either steerage or second class or third class passengers to the hospital.
Huh.
They were the ones that needed help.
Right. Yeah, you're doing fine if you can fly your own doctor to a hospital after your boat sank. Like, I mean, I think you're on a different tax bracket for sure.
Yeah, and that's what they said was, yeah, we've got to take care of the people who don't have a personal physician waiting on them when the boat lands.
What happened to Dr. Richards after he retired from his practice?
He moved back to Columbus, and I remember I was 9 or 10 years old, and my mother had told me that after school, once a week for at least an hour, I needed to go and talk to him because I would find him very interesting. I was horrified. As a 9 or 10-year-old, that was the last thing I wanted to do. As an old man, retired, moved back here, and I have to spend my school-free afternoons talking to him. I went in and sat down, and the first thing he said was, young boys always have a hero. Who's yours? And I said, well, a man named Roy Chapman Andrews. You may not have heard of him. And he said, oh, but I have. He was a good friend of mine. He headed the American Museum of Natural History, and he led an expedition to the desert of Mongolia in the 1920s, fighting off bandits to dig up the first dinosaur eggs. And in reality, he was the prototype for Indiana Jones. But when Dr. Richards told me that, I thought, this guy's interesting. And I started going back and spent a lot of time with him. And I learned an awful lot.
How long did Dr. Richards live? How old was he before he passed?
He died in his late 80s. He died, I think, around, late 1960s.
You know, it's interesting.
He had become blind. He had been one of the people working with X-rays before they knew what they were, and had become blind from that. But he had memorized his yard. He lived on Main Street in Columbus, and he would go out every afternoon and walk his yard by memory. And an amazing individual. He had memorized Shakespeare's plays. I was studying in the 7th grade, As You Like It, and he said, I like that play. Quote me a chapter and verse. So I quoted a chapter and a verse. It took him about a minute, and he suddenly recited it. I went, wow.
Well, it sounds like he was definitely a treasure for your family, but also there for Columbus. Rufus, how important is it for us to know these stories? I mean, I think there's many listening to Good Things today that never knew that there were even two, now that we know, connections to the Titanic, which I know that there are plenty of stories about people who knew people who may have distant relatives, like I know, but in terms of like direct, connections to the actual sinking of the ship, why is this important?
It's our history, it's our heritage, and actually it tells us a lot about how people lived and the way you interact with other people. At first I didn't want to go there, and I got to where I enjoyed hearing his stories, and it really created a lot of my interest in history. And growing up, we would spend a lot of time on a front porch with older relatives and sit down and drink an iced tea and hear family stories, and you learn a lot. One of the stories I learned that has a real application today is that my great-aunt's sister-in-law had been married to Upton Sinclair, and the family at the time, around 1920, was appalled that somebody in the family was married to a muckraking communist socialist, and they wouldn't associate. They all imbibed a little too much at a wedding, and learned they really enjoyed each other's company as long as politics weren't discussed, and became friends. And they would visit back and forth, and eventually got to where they respected each other enough they could talk politics in a friendly manner and with respect for each other. That's something we could use a good dose of today, I think.
Amen, Rufus. And we can also use more of you and your stories. I appreciate your time here on Good Things. People can find you in Ask Rufus columns that comes out on the weekends there in Columbus. Don't be a stranger, okay?
Okay, I won't.
All right, y'all stick with this. We got more for you up next.